You don't remember the first time you stopped caring about your birthday, but you remember the first time it felt different. The day still came, the calendar still changed, the messages still arrived, but something inside you didn't move. No anticipation, no quiet excitement, no counting down the days. Just another square on the calendar. And maybe that confused people, because birthdays are supposed to matter. They're supposed to feel warm, significant, personal. So why don't they? For some people, ignoring their birthday isn't bitterness. It isn't rebellion. It isn't depression. It's adaptation. And psychology explains it better than judgment ever could. Let's begin with something uncomfortable. For many people, birthdays stop feeling special because they were taught not to expect much from them. Psychologists call this learned helplessness. It happens when someone experiences repeated emotional disappointment. You expect something good. It doesn't happen. You try again. It fails again. Eventually, the brain adjusts, not because it wants less, but because expecting becomes painful. Maybe you invited friends once, and no one came. Maybe your parents forgot. Maybe your sibling's birthday was always bigger. Maybe you were told, don't make a big deal. The brain is efficient. It decides, if nothing special happens, I won't expect special. So instead of hoping, you disengage. Not dramatically, quietly, you say, it's just another day. And over time, you begin to believe it. But here's the key. Not caring is often protection disguised as indifference. And protection isn't weakness, it's intelligence. But that's only one layer. There's another group of people who ignore their birthday for a very different reason. They don't need it. As children, birthdays are external validation rituals. Everyone looks at you. You receive gifts. You feel temporarily central. But emotionally mature people often move from external validation to internal stability. Their worth doesn't fluctuate with calendar dates. They don't need a spotlight to confirm their existence. They've already integrated that. This is emotional independence. And emotional independence can look like detachment from ritual. Not because the ritual is bad, but because it's unnecessary. Then there's autonomy. Self-determination theory tells us that human beings thrive when they feel autonomous. In control, self-directed, authentic. Birthdays often come with social expectations. You must reply. You must host. You must smile. You must celebrate. For some personalities, that feels artificial. Performance instead of presence. So they opt out. They buy themselves something small. They cook quietly. They reflect. They rearrange their apartment. They go for a walk. They sit alone and think about the year. Not because they are lonely, but because that feels aligned. And alignment is more important than tradition. There's also something deeper that rarely gets discussed. Time awareness. When you're young, birthdays represent expansion, growth, possibility, new beginnings. But at a certain age, birthdays represent finitude, 1 year closer to the end. For analytical, introspective personalities, that awareness shifts the emotional tone. Instead of celebration, the day becomes contemplative. And contemplation isn't loud. It doesn't need balloons. It needs space. Another factor is attention tolerance. Not everyone enjoys being the center of attention. Highly introverted individuals often experience public focus as draining rather than energizing. Gifts can feel awkward. Praise can feel exaggerated. 30 identical happy birthday messages can feel mechanical. So some people deactivate social media for the day, not because they hate people, but because they prefer authenticity over ritual. There's also the attachment layer. Birthdays can trigger old attachment wounds. If your childhood celebrations were chaotic, unequal, tense, or forgotten, your nervous system remembers. Even if you consciously say you don't care, your body remembers the emotional climate. Rather than reopening that memory, many people disengage entirely. It feels safer. But here's where the story becomes more interesting. Some people who ignore their birthday are not protecting pain. They are expressing gratitude differently. They don't isolate because they feel unloved. They isolate because they feel full. They don't need a party to feel seen. They already see themselves. They celebrate daily in small ways. A morning coffee, a completed goal, a quiet evening. They don't concentrate meaning into one date. They distribute it across the year. And psychologically, that can signal integration. But there is nuance here. Not caring and pretending not to care are two different psychological states. Pretending not to care feels tense. It carries subtle resentment. It waits for someone to notice anyway. True indifference feels calm. It doesn't test anyone. It doesn't monitor who remembered. It simply exists. The difference is emotional stability. Birthdays often function as emotional audits. Who texted? Who forgot? Who called late? Who posted publicly? For people with abandonment sensitivity, this can feel like an annual vulnerability check. So removing the importance of the day removes the evaluation. No expectations, no scorekeeping, no disappointment, just neutrality. Control can feel safer than hope. There is another subtle layer that often goes unnoticed. For some people, birthdays quietly measure relational depth. Not loudly, not consciously, but internally. You notice who remembers without reminders, who writes something personal instead of generic, who calls instead of texting. And sometimes what hurts is not that people forgot, it's that they don't really know you. Birthdays can expose emotional distance. If someone buys you something that doesn't fit you at all, or sends a message that feels copied and pasted, it can highlight something uncomfortable. I am not as seen as I thought I was. And for people who value authenticity deeply, that realization weighs more than the absence of gifts. So they minimize the event, not because they reject connection, but because they don't want to test it. There's also something called emotional minimalism. Some personalities naturally gravitate toward low-intensity emotional environments. They don't crave spikes of excitement. They prefer stability. For them, big celebrations feel dysregulating. Too much focus, too much noise, too much expectation. Calm feels safer than excitement. And birthdays are often built around excitement. So instead of stimulating their nervous system unnecessarily, they simplify. A quiet dinner, a solo walk, a small ritual no one else sees. To outsiders, that may look sad, but internally it feels balanced. And balance is often misinterpreted as indifference. Interestingly, many people shift again in later adulthood, from excitement to indifference, to quiet gratitude. They don't want noise, they want acknowledgement, not spectacle. Presence, a simple dinner, a calm toast, a moment of reflection. When someone has faced illness, loss, or near-death experiences, a birthday transforms. It's no longer about gifts, it's about probability. I am still here. That sentence carries weight. So when someone says, I don't celebrate my birthday, don't rush to interpret. It could be protection, it could be growth, it could be personality structure, it could be philosophical reflection. Psychology rarely offers a single explanation. It offers patterns, and birthdays reveal those patterns clearly. The real question isn't, why don't they celebrate? The real question is, what does celebration mean to them? For some, it means validation. For others, it means exposure. For some, it means gratitude. For others, it means memory. Understanding the meaning explains the behavior. And perhaps the most important shift happens internally. You stop judging your own response. If you feel disappointed when no one remembers, that's human. If you feel peaceful spending the day alone, that's human. If you once cared deeply and now don't, that's evolution, or protection, or both. There is no psychologically correct way to experience your birthday. There is only alignment. Does the way you spend it feel honest? That is the only metric that matters. Some people throw parties. Some people turn off their phones. Some people buy themselves a cake and light one candle. Some people ignore the date entirely. None of these are wrong. They are reflections of internal architecture, and internal architecture differs from person to person. There's also something quietly empowering about choosing not to perform celebration. In a world that constantly demands visibility, choosing simplicity can be an act of self-trust. You don't need proof that you matter. You don't need a curated moment. You don't need to amplify your existence for it to be valid. For some, ignoring their birthday isn't withdrawal, it's sovereignty. It's the decision to experience life privately without broadcasting it. And that quiet self-containment often reflects something powerful. A person who has learned that meaning doesn't increase just because more people are watching. Maybe maturity isn't needing the day to define you. Living with daily acknowledgement instead of concentrating worth into one annual event. Because when meaning is distributed across life, it doesn't need to be condensed into a single celebration. And maybe the people who ignore their birthday aren't missing something. Maybe they simply refuse to outsource their value. Maybe the candle isn't a spotlight. Maybe it's just light. And whether they celebrate loudly or quietly, they're still here. And sometimes that quiet recognition is the most psychologically stable celebration of all.